Hello and welcome back. Today's lecture is going to be, during the time period of the Cold War, but we're going to be focusing a little bit more on domestic policy at the beginning stages of the Cold War. So, all the international stuff that we had been talking about in previous lectures during this time period, all of that is happening concurrently with what we're going to be talking about today. So today we're going to be talking about Truman. He took over after FDR died. We talked in previous lectures about how he was the guy that had to make the decision on whether or not to drop a bomb on Japan. Well, because he finished out FDR's term, Truman is really going to be responsible for dealing with the post World War II America, and it's during this time period that he's going to be running for. I guess we're going to call it election and not re-election, because he wasn't technically elected president; he was elected vice president. So. We're going to be talking about, what he was dealing with domestically during this time period. And so what you have to understand is after previous wars in American history, we've always seen economic downturns. And that's because war artificially inflates demand. And so, to fight a war, you got to produce more food, more boots, more bullets, more guns than you would normally. And so, when you fight a war, you see this initial economic prosperity because we're going to be producing more. But the thing about that is, throughout most of history, that's always been temporary, because once the war is over, that demand goes away. And, after World War I, that was disastrous for our economy, because all these businesses that had to keep up with the largest war up until that point ever, right? They had to take out loans. They bought new equipment. They hired a whole bunch of new people to keep up with demand. And then all of a sudden one day, boom, the demand was gone. They weren't able to sell as much stuff anymore. They had all this supply, which means there's more supply than there's demand. So prices go down at the exact same time when nobody's buying things. And then all of a sudden, those loans that they took out to be able to buy the bigger building, or for the farmers to buy more farmland, all those loans were still due. And so, that led to, a significant portion of the Great Depression. Well, that kind of always happens with wars, right? You get this boom in demand, and then the war ends, demand plummets, and we see economic downturns. Well, that's not going to happen after World War II, and it's not going to happen for a couple of reasons. We're going to be able to keep demand high in the late 1940s and 1950s for several reasons. One is the Cold War. We're not going to stand down because we have a new enemy, the Soviet Union. So we go right out of World War II and the high demand military demand from World War II to fighting a Cold War where we still got to keep up with the arms race, right? We're building nukes, we're building, more aircraft carriers and submarines and airplanes, and we're always replacing the old stuff with the newer technology because we always have to be ready for a potential war with the Soviet Union. So that's going to keep demand up, and that's going to keep people employed. The second thing that's really going to keep us from going into a recession or depression during this time period is just domestic consumption is going to be high. Think about it. We're at a really unique point in history where all the soldiers that were out fighting for 1, 2, 3 years, 4 years, they're coming back home now with all kinds of money, right? They were getting paid while they were fighting. And, while they were out on the front lines, while the 101st was defending Bastogne, they weren't spending money, right? Their paychecks were just being deposited in the bank. And so all of these soldiers, they come back home, they have years of salary saved up. And so when they come back home, they were just living through, one of the hardest time periods in American history, right? They were living through the Great Depression, and then they suffered the hardships of World War II. When they come home from war, guess what they want? They want to relax. They want safety. They want security, and they're going to spend this money to get that. And so, they're going to come back and they're going to be spending that money buying homes and buying new appliances. We've got all kinds of new technology now, vacuum cleaners, washing machines, all these types of things they're going to start buying. Eventually, we'll get to kind of the Levitt towns and these affordable housing for these people. And so they have all that money. Plus, remember what women did during World War II. They worked as well. They earned a paycheck. And so for the first time, you've got 25% of homes in America that had two incomes, not just the husband's income, which means those women who were making all that money, remember the other part of what they had to do was ration. And so they weren't allowed to go out. They weren't supposed to go out and spend all that money, right? We were saving all that, the extra food and metal to be shipped overseas. And so those women were buying as little as possible so everything else could be used for the war effort, which means they were saving money too. Now, a lot of those women will leave the workforce when their husbands come home because, they all feel like they put their life on pause for 4 years. So they want to, if they're married, they want to have babies. If they're not married, they want to marry their boyfriends that were overseas and have babies. They feel like they're 4 years behind. And so there's this rush to start families. And so a lot of them will leave the workforce to start raising families. And that's where we get the baby boom, right? A bunch of soldiers come back and guess what? They miss their women. And so, they want to have children because they feel like they're behind, but they also just, have been without women for a long time. And so, there's that. So a lot of those women will leave the workforce, but they'll do it after having saved a ton of money. And some of them will stay in the workforce, which means we're going to start to see the rise of two income households, which is going to inflate demand. And so you take all those things together, and what you're going to see is no economic recession or depression after World War II because the military still spending money, because soldiers come back with a ton of cash and they're going to be spending that money. And we're going to see women had saved up money and there's that money to spend as well. Plus, we're going to start to see two income households, which means, maybe, every family now can, not every family, but significant portions of families can afford to buy a home and a car and some modern appliances. And so we actually kind of see the reverse thing happen. Demand increases so much, we actually start to see a rise in inflation, right? So many people want to buy toaster ovens. If you're selling toaster ovens, you can essentially sell them for as much as you want. And so, that's inflation when prices go up and money is less valuable. And so Truman's going to have to be dealing with all of that. So the first thing that Truman has to deal with is reconversion. And reconversion is just shifting back to a domestically inclined economy. And so, remember FDR, the best example is the auto industry, right? The FDR outlawed the building and purchasing of private vehicles. And so, Ford Motor Company started making airplanes, right? Willow Run and the Miracle, the Ford Miracle. And so all of a sudden now Ford has to convert back to making automobiles. Well, like I said before, soldiers are coming back and they're buying homes and they're wanting to buy cars. And, a lot of these homes are going to be in suburbs for the first time. They don't want to live in the city. And so they need cars to be able to do that. And Ford has to convert back to making cars. That takes time. It takes money. The government helped convert these businesses to wartime production, but they're not going to be as helpful converting back to domestic consumption. So that means there's way more demand for cars than Ford is able to pump out cars. And so prices go up, and that is essentially inflation. So Although people are terrified of this post-war depression, the opposite happens. We see this post-war boom in demand, and more Americans have money in their pockets than ever before, and they don't have as much debt. Remember, going into the Great Depression in the 1920s, everybody thought the economy was fine because consumer spending was driven by debt. Well, if consumer spending is driven by debt, which it kind of is today, that dries up. There's a certain point where people won't loan you any money anymore, and that's what happened during the 1920s. Part of what happened during the 1920s. Consumer spending after World War II is going to be mostly driven by savings. And so this is money that people actually had. Now, we'll also see a rise in debt that will happen, but it's the fact that people have cash on hand and are willing to spend it is going to do wonders for the economy. We're also going to see another thing that Truman has to deal with is not just the conversion of the economy back and dealing with this super high demand, which is mostly a good thing, but kind of a bad thing because of inflation, but mostly good. The other thing he's going to have to deal with is strikes. We're going to see lots of strikes at home. And the reason is during wartime, we locked down a lot of these businesses, during the Great Depression. So think about it, you got to go all the way back through the Great Depression. During the Great Depression, FDR took historically unheard of control over the economy and, limited strikes. He essentially, the NRA, which later was declared unconstitutional, the National Recovery Act, tried to set wages and keep people working and things like that. And so strikes were limited during the Great Depression, and then during the war, you're going to see strikes just aren't going to be allowed. It's just not going to be a thing. And so these workers, their wages have been stagnant for years and years and years and years. And so, they've been incredibly productive. These workers helped win World War II and they know it. And so they think they deserve a raise. And so they're going to ask for one of those raises. Well, employers aren't going to want to give that raise because they're afraid of this upcoming depression. They made a lot of money during World War II, but these employers remember what happened during World War I, right? During World War I, all those same employers made a boatload of money, but then after World War I, when demand went away, they lost it all. And so, and a lot of businesses ended up failing because of that. And so, employers after World War II are taking all that cash that they made during World War II and they're holding tight to it. And they don't want to necessarily give raises, not because they're heartless businessmen. That's hyperbole. And when people talk like that, they're generally pushing some sort of political ideology on you. The reality is, yes, some businessmen were holding onto that cash greedily and not wanting to pay their workers for that. But the average businessman is just looking at history and saying, well, dang, here's what happened after World War II. Demand dried up. I don't want to give raises away now because if I give them away now, that might destroy my business if demand goes away. And so I'm going to hold on to that cash. And so you see this kind of situation where everybody's kind of justified in their opinion. Yes, workers should get a raise. And with hindsight, these employers don't really have anything to worry about, but, they didn't know that at the time. And so, yes, the workers absolutely deserve a raise and are reasonable to ask for it. And the employers are reasonably afraid that the economy might turn south. And so they want to hold on to that cash to make sure their business survives, right? And so we've got this contest of wills, and we're going to start to see, people going on strike to settle their differences. And that's the way capitalism works. The workers have something that the bosses need. And so the workers use their leverage to go on strike to ask for more. And then that's going to force the employers to make concessions. And so that's what it is. It's trading. It's not like, in the Soviet Union where there's communism and the government just comes in and says, you're going to go to work or I'm going to shoot you. Right. And so, it's the system working, even though it's going to cause some domestic tension. Right. Now, Many people are going to start to be afraid that workers are hurting the overall economy. People, there's this real sense of wanting to return to normalcy, right? If you grew up during this time period, you grew up through the Great Depression and World War II. The world is a nasty, brutish, ugly place. And all you want to do is have a stable job, have a roof over your head, and food on your table, and any drama is unacceptable because you've lived through enough of that, right? And so people are going to look at these strikes and they're going to think like, oh my God, just go away, like be happy to be alive. A lot of these people, it's even worse. I mean, some of these people survived World War I, the Spanish flu, the Great Depression, World War II. Their lives are so hard, they just want to sit down on the couch and have the dinner and live a comfortable life. And so they look at these strikers as, stop doing this, you're going to hurt the economy, just go back to work, let's be normal, let's be secure, which is what the 1950s is all about. And plus, there's fear that these people might be communists, and that's not rational. The idea of wanting normalcy and wanting to that's rational, but the idea that these people are communist, there's just no indication that that's true. About 1% of the American population is actually communist. Are some of these strikers communists? Sure, of course. Just like some business owners were greedy and didn't want to give raises because they wanted to hoard that money. But just like most businessmen were just doing what they thought was best for their business. Most of these strikers are just trying to do what's best for their family, and they're not trying to overthrow the economy. Again, the idea that workers and these strikers are mostly communists, again, that's hyperbole. That's just exaggeration. And people who try to tell you that are just pushing a political agenda. It's just not accurate. So reconversion, to review, is when we go from producing tanks back to trucks, right? That's reconversion, and it's happening all across the economy, and it's a difficult, prolonged, expensive thing to do, but we will eventually get it under control. In the meantime, it has caused inflation, which is going to trouble Truman because that inflation means that prices are going up. Voters don't like that. And so it's really damaging Truman's ability to win re-election. So the next big economic thing to happen domestically is the Taft-Hartley Act, which was designed to rein in the unions. Because again, like I said, people thought the unions were hurting the economy. People wanted a return to normalcy. People believed that unions had been infiltrated by communists. And so there's going to be a reaction against the unions. And so again, mostly, it's a balancing act. You see with unions, we've talked in previous lectures about unions, and they're vitally important, but sometimes they get out of hand and they get reined back in, and then they get reined in too far, and then they become vitally important again. And so you see it's this roller coaster ride of support for unions throughout American history. And so right now, unions are kind of on the downturn. And so the Taft-Hartley Act is specifically designed to weaken unions. And so it's going to allow companies to sue for workers who break contracts. So if you go on strike during a contract, you violate that contract, the employer can sue you for that. It's going to prohibit the closed shop and make that illegal. And the closed shop is just a business that requires everybody to be a union member. And so it's essentially saying, if you don't want to be in a union, then you have the right not to be in a union, and somebody can't fire you for that. And so, a lot of unions want all businesses to be closed shops, because that means when the union decides to go on strike, all the employees stop striking. That gives the unions a lot of power. But if you're a person that maybe doesn't want to risk going on strike, maybe you don't want to join a union and have to pay the dues, or for whatever reason, you decide not to use it. Well, then if the union goes on strike, you as an employee, you still work. And so unions hate the idea of an open shop. And so the shouldn't say all unions hate the idea of open shop, but in general. So this law prohibits the closed shop, so it gives workers the right not to be in a union, which it will damage the ability of unions to successfully strike. It'll allow the government to postpone any serious strikes, which Truman will have to do on occasion, and will forbid unions from contributions to political campaigns, and so to lessen their political authority. So you'll see the Taft-Hartley Act. Although Truman will veto this, it will get passed by a Republican House and Senate, and will attempt to rein in the power of a lot of unions. Truman will actually use some of these powers to threaten railroads with breaking strikes, railroad workers with breaking strikes, and coal miners as well, because those are vitally important industries. The next major domestic law that's going to get passed is going to be a reaction to FDR and his administration, right? FDR, was elected 4 times to office. A lot of people joke it's the imperial presidency. While he was in office, he was pretty popular, right? I mean, there were towards the end and during the second New Deal where, there was a decent portion of the public kind of turned against him, thinking that he overreached with some of his Great Depression policies. But then World War II breaks out and he successfully gets us through World War II. I mean, I know that by the time peace with Japan happens, it's Truman that's in charge. But let's face it, it's FDR and FDR's leadership that really got us through World War II. So he was very popular. But Americans start to get concerned that, like, oh my God, like, this guy has been in office way too long, and that's not good for democracy, right? We need to get in fresh blood. We need to make sure no one person becomes too powerful. I mean, democracy, because we're not a true democracy, right? I, as a citizen, don't really get to vote on laws very often. I mean, sometimes they're local ordinances and things, but we're a representative democracy, and when you get other people in power to pass laws that essentially regulate my life, we need to make sure that those people don't get too powerful, because we need them to relinquish power at some point. And the longer they're in office, there's more of a threat to our liberty and to our democracy. And so because people looked at that and were like, oh my God, maybe with hindsight, it wasn't such a good idea to keep somebody in power for so long, we're going to see the passage of the 22nd Amendment, which essentially just is term limits for the president. You get 2 terms or 10 years. So if you get elected yourself, you get to serve 2 terms, which would be 8 years total. If you take over because a previous president was killed or died in office, or later you can talk about like Richard Nixon leaving office, you could serve up to 10 years. So if, like, say, a president dies his first year in office, the vice president takes over, that means the vice president serves 3 years. Well, that counts as 1 term. So that president can run for election again, and he will only have served 7 years because that's the 2 terms. But if the president dies, a president gets elected, he dies 2 years and a day into his first term, the vice president takes over. He can finish those 2 years out, run for election, serve those 4 years, and then run again because it's under that 10 years, and he can serve 10 total years. And so the 22nd Amendment has essentially a reaction against Roosevelt and, the imperial presidency. It gets ratified in 1951, and we've been operating under that ever since. As a matter of fact, today there's actually a movement to try and put term limits on congressmen, so we don't have career politicians. There's good and bad with that. One, you get new blood, so you get fresh ideas if you have term limits. On the downside of that, you don't get as much expertise in the government, right? I mean, it's good that our politicians are able to get onto committees and are able to become experts on the areas that they become experts on, and so the laws that they pass are make a little bit more sense. The bad side is they get too much power over time and get entrenched, and there's implications to liberty and things like that. So what's the right thing? I don't. Smarter man than I has to figure that out. So that brings us to the election of 1948. The election of 1948 Truman is an almost guaranteed loser here. I mean, everybody thinks he's going to lose, mostly because of the strikes and inflation. There's a high amount of demand. People want products, they can't get it, even though the economy is overall good, right? The fact that people have money, they want to spend the money but can't, is upsetting them. The fact that prices are rising is upsetting people. That's tough. And the just all of that is and the strikes, people are afraid of the infiltration of communists and all that stuff, and so all that is kind of working against them. And so the Republicans really think that they have this one in the bag. So what we see is they elect a guy, Thomas Dewey. He's getting a lot of support from people. He's kind of middle of the road when it comes to foreign policy, and people really kind of think that he's the surefire candidate. And so Truman's got an uphill battle going against Dewey, but then we'll see the Democrats do something that are going to make it even more difficult for Truman to win re-election. Dewey has essentially laid all of the problems of the economy successfully on Truman's shoulders, and at least initially, it looks like the public is buying that. And then, like I said, the Democrats do something pretty stupid here that is going to make it even more difficult for Truman to win. They are going to run 3 candidates for office, which means that the Democrats are going to be splitting their vote. So if you're a Democrat, all the Republicans are going to vote for Dewey. Right. And then so all Dewey has to really do to win is pick up some of the independents, and he should be able to win. Generally speaking, in America, a third of us are Republicans, a third of us are Democrats, and a third of us are independents and are pretty swayable, although those numbers are changing. I think now it's like 45-45. But regardless, all Dewey has to do is pick up some of those independents to win. Democrats, on the other hand, if you're a Democrat, you have 3 choices of candidates. And so Truman, to win, he's got to convince all the Democrats not to vote for any of those other Democrats and to vote for him. And he's got to pick up some of the independents and probably some Republicans to be able to win. And so people are kind of writing off Truman, which they shouldn't. So who are the Democrats? Well, first, there's the liberal Henry Wallace. He's a very progressive Democrat. He is wants to give unions more power. He is going to get support mostly from liberals, so people further to the left. FDR was very liberal, so he's of that kind of mode. He will initially get some support from African Americans as well. He is absolutely in favor of unions and pretty extreme government intervention into the economy. And so the liberal candidates, the liberal voters kind of float towards Wallace. Then you've got Strom Thurmond. Strom Thurmond is a Dixiecrat, so he is a Southern Democrat. He is a more conservative Democrat, so states' rights, less intervention into the economy. He's more of a historically traditional Democrat, and is going to have a lot of support in the South, and he is a pro-segregationist, right? So he is going to be campaigning essentially essentially on a segregationist platform. So, not a lot of African American support, but a lot of white Southern Democrat support. So, Southern Democrat or a Dixiecrat is about states' rights. He thinks states, not the federal government, should be the ones making the important decisions in people's lives, and is, openly opposed to federal deregulation of segregation. And he, like I said, is going to get a lot of support in those southern states. Next up, Harry Truman. Truman, who is president, is going to run just a beautiful campaign, a whistle stop campaign across the country where he gets on the back of a train, very populist, actually learns quite a few lessons from Hitler, right? Hitler in his election, when we talked in previous lectures, talks about, Hitler travels the country, he puts on these big shows and gives all these speeches, really glad hands, which is not really necessarily an American tradition, right? Generally speaking, presidents have surrogates running for them. Truman's not going to do that. He's going to travel all across the country, giving, these rousing speeches from the back of trains, very populist campaign. Also Teddy Roosevelt's another really good example of a president that runs campaigns like that. And he's going to really paint Republicans in a bad way. So he's going to essentially he wants to make it look like it's the Republicans that are holding up positive change to the economy. And so he starts to try to pass a bunch of laws that he very specifically knows that the Republicans just won't be willing to pass, to get the economy going. And so as he throws these out and Republicans vote these laws down, what happens is he gets to say, it's not me. Look at the list of all the things that I did to help the economy. It's the Republicans voted against all of these things. And so they're the ones getting in the way of fixing the economy. And so he starts to be able to flip the script and start to blame Republicans for the rise in inflation and the increase in the amount of strikes and whatnot. And it's really going to start to work. Right. We've got some political cartoons here, kind of poking fun at the Democrats. We can see that this is a Democratic convention, opens here July 1948, and we've got the Democratic candidates in the back. And he says, and then we got Truman right above in the hat, and says, "Those fellows seem more concerned with defeating me than Dewey," which is a commentary on what happens when you split the ticket, right? When you run more than one candidate for president, you make it very, very difficult to win. And so another political cartoon here, we got Dewey and Truman looking at a message board with the bulletins, polls Dewey to get 30 states, electoral votes, Dewey gets 333, Truman 82, Dewey to carry Virginia, poll all over but the shouting. And so, Dewey given 27 states. All of this is, the general consensus. And we've got Dewey standing there talking to Truman. What's he going through with the election? He said it's written off. It's everybody thinks Truman is going to lose. But Truman is actually able to pull off the greatest electoral upset in the history of America, and he's actually going to be able to pull out the victory here. I mean, it's so over that newspapers the night of the election, before the results are in, have already printed headlines, Dewey defeats Truman. And so you could see as the results actually come in, and it's projected that Truman wins. We've got one of the most iconic political photographs ever taken here. Truman holding up the sign in Victory, the newspaper in Victory, that says the Chicago Daily Tribune, who's announced that Dewey defeats Truman. I mean, that newspaper that went out, and so it's one of the greatest upsets of all time. So, well, how'd he win? Well, like we talked about before, he was able to successfully blame Republicans for the problems with the economy, and then he also is running on a pretty appealing campaign. So. Republicans are overconfident. They didn't campaign the way that they should have. They thought it was in the bag. Truman never gave up the fight, and people really, found that admirable, and people like Truman because of that. And he was able to keep together the New Deal coalition of factory workers, farmers, and African Americans. I mean, that is the Democratic coalition. Democrats have to have those three votes to be able to win, and so he was able to piece that together. So how did he get them to stick together? Well, he did it through what he refers to as the fair deal. So in his inaugural speech, he gives a speech essentially talking about that the people of America deserve a fair deal from their government, and is really pushing for New Deal type of reforms within the government. He wants to keep up those New Deal policies, but he also sees that the restrictions, the government intervention during wartime, he wants to continue to do those things, and so he really sees a very large role for the federal government in the economy. There's pluses and minuses to that, right? I mean, the too much regulation can be a good thing, and not enough regulation can be a disastrous thing. And so he's pushing for more of those New Deal policies. And so, what are those New Deal policies? Well, he's going to throw a bunch of, I'm sorry, not New Deal policies, Fair Deal policies. He's going to be pushing for a whole lot of different things. He's not going to get them all, right? But these are the things he campaigned on, and these are the things he's promising to try and get pushed through Congress for the American people. He wants new civil rights legislation. Right, which is kind of ahead of its time. We're not going to get really. There's several civil rights bills, but we're not going to get truly extensive civil rights legislation until 1964. We'll have some in the 1950s, but the extensive civil rights legislation until 64. So Truman will essentially fail here, although he is laying some pretty successful groundwork for future legislation. Federal housing program, he's going to get this. And so federal housing, there's going to be about 80,000 housing units, low-income housing units made available for, low-income families. So, it's going to be the real start of, the federal government trying to make sure that there is low-income housing available for poor people. Unemployment insurance benefits. So, if you happen to lose your job, you can, collect a benefit at least for a certain period of time until you can get back on your feet. New tax cuts for the poor, federal funding for education, and federal health care and health insurance program. He's going to fail with that one right there with the health insurance too. But it lays the groundwork for programs later on. And so, even though it might be an initial failure, I don't know that you can call it a total failure. And so, what are the biggest aspects of the fair deal? Well, he will raise minimum wage from 40 cents to 75 cents, which you know, there's a debate over whether or not minimum wage laws are actually effective or if it just causes inflation. There's pluses and minuses to both. Generally speaking, most economists will agree that minimum wage needs to at least match inflation. And so, since there has been inflation in the late 1940s, most economists will tell you it is good to increase minimum wage to keep up with inflation, right? So inflation prices go up. Well, if minimum wages don't go up with inflation, so the price of milk goes up, but your paycheck doesn't. That could be pretty disastrous for poor people. And so we'll see an increase in minimum wage, during a time of inflation, which, like I said, most economists say is a good thing. He's going to expand Social Security to cover an additional 10 million people. And so, Social Security, remember what that is. That is retirement insurance. So, people pay into it. And then once they reach a certain age, they can start to collect. Now, initially, Social Security was meant for only the extremely old. And so, if you collect Social Security at 65, most people were the average, age that people died was 63 and 64, somewhere around there. And so most people did get Social Security. Truman will expand that so more people can retire, which is an absolutely necessary kind of thing. We all recognize there's going to be an age where we're just not going to be capable of working anymore. Critics will later argue that this is going to put stress on the American economy. I think today we just passed a huge stimulus bill because of the COVID thing. I think we're like $26 trillion in debt. That's basically from three programs: Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. And so, some critics will argue that this is going to cause eventually cause some pretty serious debt issues. I don't think you can argue with the numbers, but you can make an argument that debt is necessary. What's the truth there? I don't know, probably somewhere in the middle, I would imagine. But it is, the expansion of Social Security is going to allow, Mima to retire and make sure that she's, can pay the bills and has some food on the table, and is going to, the Fair Deal is also going to provide agricultural supports. And so, that's a trend that we still have today. There's ethanol, supports for those kind of things. And so, help out farmers. All right. So that concludes our lecture today on Truman and the Fair Deal. He wins a just come from behind victory for the ages and is going to use his time in office to try and expand the New Deal. Now, FDR's New Deal. And so through the Fair Deal. But unfortunately for Truman, eventually the domestic policy stuff is going to be put to the side, and what we're going to see is foreign affairs actually are going to come to the forefront, and foreign affairs will become the focus of the rest of his administration. And so we'll pick up with that in tomorrow's lecture. Thank you very much. Have a good day.